Your little one is in the corner of the room, and they're talking to someone, in full, clear sentences, with pauses, like they're waiting for an answer. There is no one there. You step closer. You can almost make out the words. They laugh at something that was apparently just said. Then, without turning around, your child says, very calmly, "Shh, Mama's watching." You freeze. You didn't make a sound. Most parents smile, maybe film it, maybe assume it's just a phase, something children do and eventually grow out of. But cognitive developmental scientists at some of the world's leading research institutions have spent decades studying exactly this behavior, and what they found doesn't just change how you understand imaginary friends. It changes how you understand the developing mind itself. Let's start with the explanation most people reach for first. Children have imaginary friends because they're lonely, or bored, or simply can't tell the difference between fantasy and reality yet. It sounds reasonable, but here is the problem with that theory. Research published in the journal Developmental Psychology found that children with imaginary friends are not more socially isolated than children without them. In fact, the data shows the opposite. Children with imaginary companions tend to score higher on measures of social understanding, empathy, and the ability to read other people's emotions. They are not retreating from social reality. They are practicing it. And when researchers started looking more carefully at what children were actually doing during these conversations, not just that they were having them, what the data revealed was something that stopped the field cold. Your child is not confused about what is real. They are doing something far more sophisticated than that. Something that the most advanced AI systems on Earth still cannot fully replicate. In 2004, psychologist Marjorie Taylor at the University of Oregon published what became one of the landmark studies in this field. She and her team had been tracking 152 children over multiple years, documenting the presence and nature of their imaginary companions in extraordinary detail. What she found was this. By age 7, approximately 65% of children had created an imaginary friend at some point. Not a small minority, not a developmental quirk, the majority of children. But the finding that reshaped the entire field was not the number. It was what the children were actually doing during those interactions. When Taylor's team analyzed the conversations children had with their imaginary companions, they found something that looks, from a neuroscience perspective, almost identical to what adults do when they prepare for high-stakes social situations. The children were running simulations. They were creating a social partner they could control, a partner whose responses they could script, whose emotions they could manage, and whose perspective they could practice understanding. Researchers at the University of Zurich later found that children with imaginary friends demonstrate advanced development in what cognitive scientists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have thoughts, feelings, and perspectives that are different from your own. Theory of mind is not a small thing. It is the cognitive foundation of empathy, diplomacy, friendship, and every complex social interaction a human being will ever have. And your child is building it by talking to someone who isn't there. And researchers note that the seeds of this behavior begin even earlier, in the first year of life, when babies begin tracking invisible agents, responding to empty spaces, and practicing proto-conversations with objects that cannot respond. What looks like random behavior in a 6-month-old is the earliest version of exactly this. Your baby is already building the architecture. But here is where it gets genuinely surprising. Because the imaginary friend is not just a social training tool. Neuroscientists have found that it does something to the developing brain that nothing else quite replicates. Researchers at Harvard's Graduate School of Education have spent years studying how children use narrative, the act of constructing and telling stories, to build cognitive architecture. And imaginary friends, it turns out, are one of the most powerful narrative engines a young brain can use. When a child invents a companion, They are not just imagining a person. They are building a character with consistent traits, preferences, memories, and responses. They are maintaining that character across days, weeks, sometimes years. They are tracking what that character knows versus what they themselves know. And they are doing all of this without any external system to help them. No notes, no reminders, no prompts. Purely in working memory. Neuroscientist Dina Weisberg at Drexel University has studied what happens in the brain when children engage with pretend scenarios involving their imaginary companions. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, working memory, emotional regulation, and executive function, shows significantly elevated activity. The same region, the same elevated activity that researchers at MIT found is strengthened by face-to-face interaction with caregivers in infancy. What you do with your baby in those early months, the eye contact, the back and forth, the patient waiting for a response that hasn't arrived yet, is building the same neural pathways that the imaginary friend will later activate. You are not separate from this process. You are the foundation of it. Your child is doing cognitive construction work, and the imaginary friend is the scaffolding you help them build. There is one more dimension to this that almost no one outside academic circles discusses. In 2019, researchers at Durham University in the UK conducted in-depth interviews with adults about their childhood imaginary companions. Many of the participants were now in their 30s and 40s. What the researchers found was striking. The majority of participants reported that their imaginary companion had felt entirely real to them, not as a hallucination, not as confusion, but as a genuine subjective presence. And when asked about the function that companion had served, the answers were remarkably consistent across all participants. The imaginary friend had been a safe space for emotional processing, a place to rehearse difficult conversations, a place to express feelings that felt too large or too complicated to bring to the adults in their lives. Psychologists call this externalized self-regulation. Your child is not just playing. They are building the emotional toolkit they will use for the rest of their life, and they built it out of thin air, literally. Now, I want to tell you about a finding that researchers initially did not know what to do with, because it seemed to suggest something about the nature of the imaginary friend that went beyond developmental psychology entirely. Cognitive scientist Alison Gopnik at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the world's leading authorities on the infant and toddler mind, has argued in her research that very young children may not experience the boundary between imagination and reality the same way adults do, not because they are confused, but because their brains are structured differently. Gopnik's research suggests that the young child's prefrontal cortex, which in adults acts as a filter, suppressing irrelevant information, narrowing attention, focusing perception, is not yet fully active. This means young children are operating with a wider, less filtered perceptual field than adults. They notice more. They are open to more. Gopnik describes the infant and toddler brain as something closer to a state of flow, the state that adult meditators, artists, and scientists spend years trying to access. Your baby is not developmentally behind because their filter isn't fully formed yet. In certain measurable ways, what this means for imaginary friends is this. When your child tells you, with complete certainty, that there is someone in the corner of the room. They may not be imagining it in the sense that you imagine things. They may be perceiving something that your more filtered, more narrowed adult brain has learned to edit out. The science does not tell us what that something is, but it does tell us that the child's perception of it is entirely genuine. There is one final layer to this, and it may be the most important thing in this video. Researchers studying the long-term outcomes of children who had imaginary friends have found something that challenges almost every instinct parents have about this behavior. The standard parental response to an imaginary friend is either to play along with mild amusement or to gently redirect, to encourage the child to play with real children instead. But the research says this is the wrong instinct. A 2017 meta-analysis published in the journal Child Development reviewed data from across 20 years of studies on imaginary companions. The conclusion was unambiguous. Children who were allowed to develop their imaginary companions freely, without redirection, without dismissal, without being told the friend was not real, showed measurably better outcomes in creativity, emotional resilience, and social competence by middle childhood. The imaginary friend is not a replacement for real relationships. It is a rehearsal room for them. Every time you sit down next to your child and ask what their imaginary friend thinks about something. Every time you set a plate for them at dinner or move over on the couch to make room. You are not indulging a fantasy. You are signaling to your child that their inner world is real and valid and worth taking seriously. And the research is clear on what that signal does. It builds a child who grows up to believe the same thing about the inner worlds of other people. You didn't create a lonely child. You created enough safety and trust that your toddler feels confident populating their world with characters worth talking to. That is not a red flag. That is healthy brain development in action, and it started with everything you did in those first months, before they could even speak. Now, I need to tell you about the one thing to watch for, because there is a distinction that matters here. An imaginary friend is a companion a child chooses, someone they talk to, play with, occasionally blame for broken things. It is fluid, it is creative, and the child maintains awareness that it exists in their imagination, even while fully engaging with it. What looks different is a child who cannot distinguish, who appears genuinely distressed by a presence, who seems frightened rather than playful, or whose communication about the companion carries a quality of compulsion rather than creativity. That distinction, playful engagement versus genuine distress, is the line developmental psychologists ask parents to watch for. If you notice it, talk to your pediatrician. Early attention changes outcomes. If it is the first, let it run. The science is entirely on your side. If you want to understand why babies laugh at things that aren't there, at empty corners, at 3 a.m., at something only they can see, that is the next video. And the neuroscience behind it is stranger than any explanation you have heard before.